Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning. My name is Mackenzie Graham, and I'm one of the guys, as it was mentioned, who's working up in Lancaster with Wayne Berger. We've come up here to try and plant a church in Littleton and work with the church in Lancaster. This morning, we are going to be talking about the idea of loving yourself. Not really a topic that you hear much about in the church or read much about in the Bible. Really, what we hear about most often is loving your neighbor and loving God. But the Bible does talk about loving yourself. In order for me to be able to feel like I can talk with you about this, I think I need to tell you a little bit about me and sort of set the groundwork a little bit. My dad was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And when he was 18, he moved out to the States to go to a preaching school. And he went through a lot of different schooling out here and did a lot of different things. And I was born while he was in Tennessee. And by the time I was 6, my dad and mom, of course, had decided to move back to Ireland to plant the church there and to work on trying to save souls there. Being 6 years old, I didn't have a say in the matter. And so I moved too. And so I grew up there, and I spent 21 years there in close to Belfast. I went to school there, went to high school, and then to college, and started working different jobs there. And throughout all of the time that I was there, I was trying to be a Christian, not doing much of a job, and also struggling with my own self-worth and value that seen in myself from me. And I really did struggle with that for a long time. Out of college, having studied music, I went straight into a job working in a coffee shop. And I worked a lot there and would come home from that job drained, feeling empty. And I would try to distract myself by watching documentaries and learning as much as I possibly could as basically a distraction. But it wasn't really fixing anything. It wasn't really helping with the underlying lack of self-appreciation, self-love, that kind of thing. And while I was working in the coffee shop and watching all of the different documentaries, sometimes that would include YouTube videos, and I came across a guy doing leather work on YouTube, making a lot of production videos of him showing you how to do leather work. And so I started watching that, and I found myself really engrossed in it and really enjoying the watch of it. And eventually, I decided to try it, and so I did. And I started buying tools and stuff on eBay and buying terrible quality leather and making really, really bad items. And so and they were honestly garbage. They weren't worth buying, but they were worth giving away. And as I began to work with this, I would work in the coffee shop, and then I would do leather work basically until it was time to go to sleep so that I could work in the coffee shop again. And so I did. But every waking hour outside of the coffee shop, I was working on leather stuff. I was making things, I was giving things away because I enjoyed the sort of interaction of giving something to someone. That was very enjoyable to me, and that was kind of a balm to this lack of self-appreciation. That kind of helped a little bit. And God blessed me with what I was doing. At that time, I had no intention of teaching or preaching. I was a Christian, trying to do well, not doing very well, but I was living the life and I was building a business. Eventually, about a year and 3 months-ish, I had built, with God's blessing, the business to the point that I was shipping stuff all over the world. And it was working. It was success. I was making a living. And I had quit the coffee shop by that point. And it all kind of hit me in one day that even though I had the money and the appreciation of people, it wasn't fixing the internal problem. And on the same day, I realized what would. I think it took me to get to a point of somewhat success to realize that success is not what the problem was. The problem was a lack of helping people and a lack of my ability to minister to people on God's behalf. My dad had been teaching me all of this stuff across the years, and I had been ignoring it. And I had never even realized I was ignoring it. And so with a lot of prayer and discussion with my dad and my brother, who is also a preacher, I closed the business and I moved to Denver with God's help, and I went through school. And the problem is fixing. The self-worth issue is going away. And it's because of my relationship with God and my now effort in God's kingdom. That's the fix for me. It may not be the fix for you. So now you know a little bit about where I came from and the things that I have dealt with. Now we're going to talk about what the Bible says about loving yourself. And to do that, we need to talk about what the Bible says about loving others. Because, as we'll see, it's about, well, the verse is this. Let's read Luke 10. Luke 10, 25 and all the way through the end of 27. Luke 10, 25 through 27. And behold, a scholar of the law stood up and was putting him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. We need to talk a little bit about love, the concept of love, and what is being commanded here. The way we understand love today is different than how they understood love in the first century. In the Greek language, there are 4 words for love, and the word that we're dealing with here is to seek the highest good of someone, even if it costs you something. Self-sacrificial love which seeks the highest good of someone else. Well, that is the love that this verse tells us to love God with, and to love our neighbor with. And what is interesting to me about this passage is that it says at the end of verse 27, and love, and then he goes down through it, and then, and your neighbor as yourself, in the same way in which you love yourself. We are to love our neighbors. So, if we ascertain how we are to love our neighbor, if we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, we can see how we are supposed to be loving ourselves. Okay, so we've got a plan. We can walk through and see if we love our neighbors in a specific way, then we can see how we're supposed to love ourselves. The way we do that is in 2 different ways. One is physical and one is spiritual. So, how do you love your neighbor physically? Let's read the rest of this passage down 28 through 37 and see what he does with this. See what Jesus tells us here. You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied and said, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him, and went away leaving him half dead. And a priest happened to be going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. And he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, Take care of him. And whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said to him, The one who showed mercy towards him. Then Jesus said to him, Go and do the same. This passage here answers 2 questions for us. It answers the question of how do you love your neighbor, and who is your neighbor? This word that we've been talking about so far, to love your neighbor as yourself, means to seek the highest good of someone else, even if it costs you something. What the Samaritan man did for the man who had been robbed and beaten was just that. Physically, he sought that man's highest good at his own expense. Let's go down through what he says happened. Verse 34, and he came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. First thing he did was he derailed his journey. He was going somewhere. He was on a mission to do something. He set that aside for the time being. Whatever that was, we don't know, but he set that aside. And he came up to him and bandaged up his wounds. That is to get your hands dirty, working, helping someone. He poured oil and wine on them. What we may kind of lose here is that oil and wine in the first century were essentially the best medicine that you could buy. Wine had antimicrobial and antibacterial properties. And being in a desert climate, you would have things that would get into the wounds, whatever the wound was. And that would cause infection. So wine was sort of antimicrobial and would help with infection. And again, being in a desert climate, pouring oil on a wound helps to seal it from the sand and to seal it from anything else that might get into it, including the air drying it out, which would make it incredibly painful. So this man has derailed his journey. He has come, he's got his hands dirty in trying to help this person, and he has spent things of his own resources to get this job done. He also put the man on his own donkey, which probably means that he had to walk. Then he took him to the inn and used his own money to pay for it, as well as then further taking care of it himself. You can see that this Samaritan was seeking the highest good of this person physically. He was. And he used things of his own to get it done. He used of his own good. He sacrificed of his own things to seek the highest good of this person physically. So who is this man's neighbor? Well, to the Samaritan, this is just some random guy that's been attacked. There's no relation here, or at least the text doesn't tell us that there is, and that would go against the point of the passage, because the man is asking, who is my neighbor? So, then, what is the answer in this text to the man's question, who is my neighbor? The answer is anyone that you can help. So physically, we love our neighbor by helping them when we can help them. That's a choice. That's a choice. So if we can choose to help people that we are able to help, it's not really an emotional connection. It's just a choice to obey God's command and to help when you can help. The way we see love today is an emotional connection. But this is an action. This is many different actions, or it could be many different actions, and it all bases itself on the choice to obey God's command to love your neighbor, to put your neighbor above yourself, and to use your resources to help them. That is what this text, the form of love in this text, means. So if we can love our neighbor physically, how do we love ourselves physically? How do you seek the highest good of yourself by self-sacrificing for yourself? That's kind of a contradiction. Well, it's not if you think about it in sense of time. If you think about it, most of us have worked a job we didn't want to work so that we could keep an apartment, a place to live, and food on our table. And maybe people rely on you as well. Maybe you have to pay for other people too. That's also this same kind of self-sacrificial love. But with talking about loving yourself self-sacrificially, it is a self-sacrifice to retain that job and go and do the work so that tomorrow you can pay your rent. A bit of a pep talk almost. Well, it's true. And it's not only just from a monetary perspective, but what about, say you got an anger problem? Can you go see a therapist or work on your anger today in a self-sacrificial way so that tomorrow or 10 years down the road, you've got less of a struggle with that? What about if you've been struggling with alcoholism or some kind of drug addiction? Can you sacrifice today so that your tomorrow is a little better? And maybe 10, 15 years down the line, you don't struggle with that anymore? You can. That is what it means to self-sacrificially love yourself in this life physically. When we can do that, that's a choice. It's not a matter of emotionally connecting with yourself yet. That will come later. Most people struggle at some stage in their life, or at least many people do, with a feeling of dislike for the self. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. Sometimes we do something that we feel guilty about, or we regret greatly, or we were forced into a situation that we really didn't have any good way out of, and so we took the best one we could, but we still feel guilty. Then that can bring self-loathing. And when the Bible talks about loving yourself, it really isn't talking about feeling like you're a good person. It's talking about making the sacrifices in this life to treat yourself reasonably well, to sacrifice for yourself. Okay, so that's an interesting way to think about it physically. So what about spiritually? How do you love your neighbor spiritually? What is the single greatest or highest good, as the definition is? What is the highest good of your neighbor spiritually? I think it has to be that you have a saving relationship with God, that person has a saving relationship with God. So then how do you seek that, even if it's self-sacrificial? Well, you share the gospel with them. It's really that simple. You bring them to the best of your ability, even if it costs you your friendship or whatever the case may be. You try your best to bring them to a saving relationship with God. Why? Because the highest good of that person is to have an eternity that is with God rather than in hell. Okay, so you're basically, to love your neighbor spiritually, self-sacrificially seeking their highest good, is to fulfill the Great Commission, to go into all the world and make disciples. Okay, seems simple enough, and again, it's a choice. We can make that choice, and we can go, and we try to evangelize, we try to share the gospel with people, because we know that intrinsically, that the best thing for them is an eternity with God. Okay, so then how do you love yourself self-sacrificially, seeking the highest good of yourself spiritually? The same thing. It's the same thing. You make disciples of all the nation, but that includes you. Every day, from the moment that you have become a Christian, been baptized, and done all the different steps that you need to do, you get out of bed, and maybe you don't even think about it. Maybe you see it the way I kind of see it, which is that I made that decision back then to be a Christian, and I don't need to make that choice today. But in some senses, every single day that you get out of bed and you decide to live the life the way Christ would have you, then you have taken up your cross and you are choosing to love yourself for eternity. Because it's a choice. You're seeking your own highest good by self-discipling yourself to Christ so that you will gain eternity with God. Okay. So we've kind of talked about how you love yourself and how you can actually choose to do that. But what about the emotional connection side of all of this? God made man in a way that for almost everyone, to help someone else makes you feel good. It's fulfilling to help someone else. I found that a little bit in my leatherworking business. I would give something away to someone or give them a great discount on something that they needed because it was helpful, you know? And that always made me feel good for a little while, and it was helpful. And there's a sense in which we can do the same for ourselves spiritually. We can give up now our lusts and our desires, our will on things. Say you were tempted into something and you decided to go and walk that path for a minute. Say pick a sin. It doesn't really matter. It applies to all of them. When you decide to go and sin, you are putting your will above God's. And if you want to self-sacrificially seek your highest good in the long term spiritually, what that means is to put your will back underneath, that's the sacrificing self part, the will of God, so that your eternity is with God. And the outcome of all of this is development over the years. And what will come from that, both physically and spiritually, is betterment. And out the other end of that, you'll be able to see yourself a little bit brighter. and emotionally you'll not just loathe yourself quite as much. Maybe you don't suffer with this, and maybe this is all kind of moot to you, but to someone it's not. To some people it's not. And this kind of discussion can be helpful because we often misunderstand what it means to love your neighbor. It's very difficult to conjure up emotion for someone. I don't really think we're able to do it. I'm not able to do it. But I can choose to seek that person's highest good. I mean, especially if somebody's been mean to you, how do you love them? That's hard, man. That's hard. But you can choose to seek their highest good and obey this command. And what will come with time is one of two things. Either that person will just hold you right at bay, and that's their choice, but you've still obeyed the command. Or you will gain a brother or a sister because your effect on their life will have brought them, because remember, you're seeking their highest good, not just physically, but spiritually and eternally. You will bring them to Christ. All of this stuff applies directly to me. It may help in some way for you. What I have seen since going to school and since beginning to try to work in ministry is development, just like we're discussing here. And my own lack of like for myself, it's easing. It's not as bad. Because I know that I'm doing something valuable and I'm helping. And I have chosen, looking back at my actions to go to school, I see some of this choice to love myself, put my future self above my current self in this. I see self-love as a choice in that, and now the emotion is starting to come. And here I am, a little less poorly off. I don't know how to put that. I hope this discussion has been somewhat useful to you and helpful in some way. If you have anything you want to talk to me about it, I'll be here for a while. So.